Hi guys, it's Will here from the iQAdemy, and today I'm going to give you a brief demonstration of some of the record and playback functionality that's offered by the Parasoft SoaTest tool. So the record and playback feature is essentially a means of simulating end user activity on an application. So for example, if you've built a website, you need to be sure that a customer can enter the website, perform any functions that are necessary to them, and then exit the site successfully without any mishaps. And that's where the record and playback comes into it, because it allows you to record these full-length scenarios and then play them back as if you were a user and you were performing these tasks on the site. So what it allows you to do also, though, is using some of the functions that I'm going to talk about. Once you have these scenarios recorded, you can then manipulate them to improve your test coverage and minimize the effort involved in actually doing it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a brief introduction to the tool as well as a little tour around the user interface, so just so you know what goes where and what's happening, as well as a description of some of the functions that we're actually going to be demonstrating before I hand you over to some of my fellow iCads, Sahana and Meghna, who are then going to talk you through some actual pre-recorded scenarios to really demonstrate the tool in action. Okay, so this is the user interface of the tool, and this is what's going to greet you every time you open it. As you can see, it's split up into a number of different sized windows. Over here on the left we have the Test Case Explorer, and this is basically where you keep track of all your projects that you're working on, as well as any tests that fall within those projects. So as you can see here, we have three different projects. We have the Foxtel presentation, and zero presentation. So if we drop the presentation project down, you can see that there are two tests in there. There's test 1 login and test 2 fill form. There's also a data source, but I'll go into that when I talk about data linking. It's one of the functions that I'm going to mention. So what we can do now is we can then drop this test 1 down, and it'll show you there's test suite, the environments, and the web scenarios. If you drop the web scenarios, it shows you exactly what you're doing within the test. So the test 1 is, this is the first step, so they're going to pass or fail, so all the test steps are labeled as tests themselves. So the first step is to navigate to the zero login page. So what you can do now is if you click on this test step, it's going to bring it up in the main window over here in the middle, and here is where you can manipulate your test steps. You can change the actions that you want, or you can just view them. For example, here, this is what it shows in the browser before the action takes place. And obviously there's going to be nothing because it is the first step, so it's opened the browser onto this page. But if you look into the user action, you can see here exactly what we're doing. The action is to navigate, and it's got a drop down here with loads of actions in it. So the action is to navigate to this fixed URL, and you can also set wait conditions for it, which basically it tells the tool when it's okay to go ahead with the next step. So what we've got here is it's telling us to wait for the page to load, and then it's saying wait for the element that's necessary for the next user action, which is going to be one of the login fields. So you can see once you drop the test down, you can see the browser action, the browser contents after the action's been performed. So here we have the zero login page, and you see highlighted here in green is the element that's necessary for the next step. So it treats a login as a scenario of itself, the login form. So you can see here it's got a folder that you drop that down, and here are the tests within that folder. So the first test is to type williamsmith526@gmail.com into the email field of the login. So you can see the pre-action browser contents are there, and you've got the user action is different from before because the action now is to type. The value that you're typing is a fixed value. You can also parameterize these values. That's another thing I'm going to talk about with data source linking. And then it just tells you information about the element that you're typing the information into. You can also link data sources. Again, I'll go into that soon. And then you can check the wait conditions. Again, wait for the element for the next user action. So if we go into the next user action, it's to type the password in. So if we go to the user action here, it says action is type password instead of just type this time, and that's why these characters down here are encrypted, because we've set the user action to type password. So that's just a little insight into how you navigate through the test case explorer. You can also quite easily create new tests or projects if you want. Just this button up here, you create a new project, create a new test, or you can quite simply go to the project that you want, say presentation, right click and add a new test or data source. So it's really easy to test and to build them and to basically navigate through them, because you can get to have quite a few tests over in this pane over here. Down the bottom here we've got the quality tasks window, and that basically it shows any defects or errors with a test. Once a test's been run, if a step fails, then it's going to show a task in this window, and what you can then do is you can click on the task and it'll bring information up about it in the main window, and it'll tell you exactly where it's failed and the reason behind it. So the bottom right, this little window here is test progress window. Basically just as the test is running, it shows you how far through it is how far through the test you actually are. So up on the right hand side here is the data repositories window, and that is, like it says, it's basically where you keep all your data repositories. So that's just a brief intro to the tool and a little look around, so you're not lost when the other two are going through their actual scenarios. So here's a list of some of the functions that we're going to be demonstrating today. We're going to start with modularization, data linking, assertions, handling dynamic and static HTML elements, and then Sahan is going to talk about mobile testing. So the first thing I'm just going to introduce you to is the modularization, and that is basically breaking down of full-length scenario into smaller segments that are then put together to create that scenario. And the reason we use it is basically because it allows us to save time with test creation as well as test maintenance. So I'll just give you an example here. The login test that I showed you earlier in the tool itself is pretty much all sitting here. It's got the test suite reference, that's what it says when it's saying that it is referencing another test. So here we can see this is the exact same test. Navigate to the login at 0, and then type William Smith into the email, type this password, and then click login. But as you can see, this segment here is actually part of another test. It's a new leave request using calendar. So here you can see the next part is after you've hit login, you can see my 0. And you can see that they're clicking and performing different test steps. So the reason that we do this is because basically if something changes or if something goes wrong and you've recorded this whole thing in one sitting, you have to do the whole thing again. Whereas if you've got it broken into multiple pieces, it's quite easy to take the part that's broken, fix it, and slot it back in again, and it saves you a whole lot of time and effort in both the creation of the test and the maintenance. So what I'll do is I'll go back into the tool and I'll show you how easy it is to actually link one, and I'll show you one that's linked. So here's my login test. This test 2, fill form, is using the same website, but obviously you have to log in. Every test that we've created on the 0 website, you have to log in to perform the action. So we created one login module. This is the original login module here, and we link it to these other ones. So if you see, drop down to the web scenarios, we've got the test suite reference here. So click on that, and it says, here we go, test 1 login, and that's the test that it's referencing. And you can set this up afterwards, after you've created the test, or when you create a new test, like I'll quickly show you now. You can say, okay, create a new test in the project presentation. We'll name it test 3 delete form. So it's going to be a web test. We're going to record a new web scenario, but instead of ticking record new web scenario, we're going to go ahead and tick record starting from a reference scenario. Hit next, and here's where it gives you the option to pick the scenario. So if we go to the workspace, we can go to presentation, and rather than click login, we'll click fill form test. So what that means is when we record, it's going to play through the login, and then it's going to play through the fill form, and that's where we can start recording our steps, where we can then proceed to delete the form that we've just done. So it's a really, really helpful function. It basically saves you heaps and heaps of time and heaps of effort in terms of creating a test and in terms of fixing them when they break, if they break, or if the application changes. So next I'm going to talk about data sources and data linking. So what this lets us do is it lets us basically link data to our tests, and it lets us basically automate the testing. So we can hit the play button once and it's going to run through the test over and over again using different data each time, and it's kind of the purpose of automation. So this is a screenshot from within SoaTest, and these are the different data files that you can upload. So you can do an Excel spreadsheet or an in-house table or CSV file. This is an example of a table that we created within SoaTest. So as you can see, there are a number of columns. We've got first name, last name, day, month, year, address, town, city, postcode, and full name. So each of these columns is obviously going to have data, and this is obviously a very small table in terms of what you can be dealing with in a real life situation. So this is created. I can show you how easily it is created in the tool. Here, presentation, add new, data source. Simple, and you can choose it. Here's that table that was on the slide. You can choose what you want. This is obviously a table, and then you can name it and carry on from there. So what you can then do is link it. Link it to your test or any test that you want. So for example here, it's kind of like that second test in the presentation project is fill form. So here you're filling out rows of a form or fields on a form, and you've got the first name, middle name, last name, date of birth. What you can then do is you can then link this data sheet to put those values in. It's then going to iterate until every row of data has been tested and either passed or failed. So I'm going to show you quickly how you can parameterize these values. So for example, I'll use the login test again, and I'll show you if you've got an application that has, say, 10,000 users, and each user has their own credentials, and you need to be sure that every user can log in. What you can do is go to the user action. Here it says type the value that's fixed, William Smith, but you don't want it fixed anymore. You want it to type in William Smith, and then you want it to type in the next value, which was, in that other one, it was John. So you link your data source. Presentation data source has already been linked, so it already has a data source on it. You can view it here. Data sources, presentation data source is going to pop up in the main window. Here, email, Will Smith, John Smith, Tim Sherwood. So what you can then do is you can go back here and you can set this value from fixed, you can change it to parameterized. And once you've done that, it gives you the option to drop down and choose either email or password. And obviously we want the email to be the email. So now what that's going to do, if you save it, that will let you, well, you've done it already. All you have to do is hit play and it's going to cycle through those. But you also have to parameterize the password, which is just simply done again. Let's change the password, and you can select it. Obviously some tables are going to have much more field, much more columns than this, but the logic remains the same. You just pick the column that you want to parameterize it to, and you're good to go. So now if I were to play this test, it would play through 3 times. The first time it would enter Will Smith at Hotmail with that password. Second time it would enter this. Third time it would enter that, and then it would stop playing. And that's just a little example of how simple it is to parameterize using the SoaTest, and really just to explain the purpose of it. And again, Megna's going to play a recorded scenario that actually does have a parameterized test, and it's going to run through a couple of times so you can see it happening. The next thing that we're going to demonstrate is how the tool handles dynamic and static HTML elements. So the difference between those two things are, sometimes when you load a page, or every time you load a page, any element on that page, for example a field or a button, it has an ID attached to it. And quite often those IDs remain the same. If you reload the page, you come back And on here, right now on the slide, is an example of a static element. So we've got the first name field, and in this first instance here, it's got the ID, first given name, with some numbers after it. And in the second instance, we literally just refresh the page, it comes up, and it's the same value. So that's great, because that means all you have to do is click on the field, type your value, and it's going to find it again the next time you do it. But that's not always the case with HTML elements. See, on this next slide, we have an example of a dynamic element, which means it changes. Every time you refresh the page, the value changes, and it trips testing tools up all the time. So here you can see it, paid to name. It's underlined in green, it means it's the same. If it's underlined in red, it changes, and you can see 3EBA for the first instance. The second instance starts with looks like a D29DE, and you can tell instantly that those are different numbers, and that's gonna mess with the tool, because it's going to be looking for this ID and it's not going to find it. So what we do then is we use what was called an XPath to search for the tool. It's basically just a search query that's used on HTML elements, and instead of looking for the whole ID, it lets you look for just parts of the ID that remain the same. So here, that's why we've got them underlined in green. You can see that every time you reload this page, it starts with paid to name and it ends with value. So we can then, using what we know, we can search for this ID. So what I can show you is an example of a working XPath. So here it is. We've got the input starts with the ID paid to name, and that's going to search for the first element on the page that starts with the ID paid to name, and it's going to immediately find this. And because this is the first element on the page full stop, it's going to find it. But there are sometimes trouble where you're looking for an element that actually has the same starting ID, but they're again dynamic, and that's when you can narrow the search down again. You can use value. It's got paid to name, and it includes value in it somewhere, and it's going to find that. And it's really, really helpful to be able to find dynamic elements, because it can be really frustrating when you can't. So it's quite simple. Again, I can show you how to locate a dynamic element using the tool. See, what you can do then is, say we go to this one, type email, use element properties. When you're trying to find it using element properties, it uses that, or you can change it to use XPath, and it gives you an XPath. And what you can do then is you can adjust that just by typing in there to narrow your search to make it more robust. But again, it's just a really simple method that enables you to find things that sometimes are quite difficult to locate for the tool. So the next thing we're going to talk about is the assertions or checkpoints that you can use in SoaTest. And the purpose for these is basically to make sure that your test is running properly, because the whole purpose of test automation is basically to reduce the work, and it's not much good if you're constantly having to check on it to make sure it's working properly, because you're still just working just as hard. So that's why we use checkpoints. And what you can do with these is tell it at a certain step to check for a certain thing, and if it finds it, it doesn't actually do anything. It just gives the test a tick. If it doesn't find what it's looking for, that's when it sends up a red flag saying, hey, this might not be working exactly how you want it to. So for example here, you can see this is an up-close version of the validation tool, which is what it's labeled in the test case explorer. It's looking for this field, John Smith. So what you can do is you can set it to look for a field which says you're going to be on the right page. So if you're trying to use the test to navigate to the employees page, you can say, okay, I want you to look for this field, that's employee name. And when it sees that, it'll say, okay, yep, we're on the right page. Or what you can also do is, just like we parameterize the values just to link the data, we can also parameterize the checkpoint, meaning that we can link the checkpoint to the data source, and rather than looking for this field, it's going to look for the value John Smith, and that will, just like the test itself, iterate again. So in the next run through, rather than look for John Smith, it's going to look for the next value in the next row down the column, which is very, very helpful because it basically lets you know that every piece of data has gone in exactly as you wanted it to and exactly as you expected, and you only have to parameterize it once. Say you've got 10 columns, you go in one time to each column, parameterize it, set the validation, and you can walk away from that, and it can run for, well, it can run until all the data has been expended, and you can be confident in the fact that it's run properly. So that's really the main purpose of validations, is just to improve the confidence in your test and to improve the robustness so you can know it's working fine. And the last thing I'm going to talk about is mobile testing. So Hannah's going to go into mobile testing using Appian. It's an open source software that enables SoaTest to emulate mobile devices and then talk to them, which basically enables you to run the tests that I've just shown and use the functions that I've just shown on mobile devices, which is huge in the current market. The mobile field is just getting bigger and bigger, and if you want to compete, you have to be able to function well on mobile devices. So it's a really big part of it, and Sahana's going to talk more about that. But that's all from me, so thank you. Sahana's up next. Cheers.